Well, hi, welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast. I'm Paul Zeideman. Quite excited to be talking to my guest today. My gosh, he's got a list of job titles almost as long as my arm, and I got long arms. He is a screenwriter, a director, a producer. He is an author of the Save the Cat Writes for TV. He's a script consultant, and this is a new one. He's the director of the supernatural fantasy podcast, Black Velvet Fairies, and that's on bloodydiscussing.com. The one and only Jamie Nash. Jamie, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for reading that list to make me feel good.
I was going to say to any of those, like, oh my gosh, I did do that, didn't I?
Yeah, it all kind of gets lumped together. It's just one big crazy career.
Hmm.
That's all it is.
And all of it, at the heart of it, is all writing, and that's what we're here to talk
The
about
heart of it is
today.
all writing.
That's right.
Yes.
So, as regular listeners and viewers of the show are familiar, we like to get things started by talking about things we may have read or watched lately. I will get things started, so give Jamie a few minutes to kind of collect his thoughts. So, I'll start with the watching part. I watched the second part of the documentary Steve on Apple TV. It's about Steve Martin, and this one is kind of about his film career and also talking about like his post stand-up career. And as my wife commented, it's almost a little sad because he's
Mhm.
led such he even though he's such a public figure, he kind of like keeps himself very private. He has a very private life outside of the spotlight, and it's interesting to get a glimpse of that, but also to see all the work that he's done on some of his films and how he reacted to how those films were received. It was just fascinating to watch. So if you get the chance to watch both of those, I highly recommend that. Still very, very much enjoying Shogun on Hulu. The latest episode was just really good. I think they're just hitting it out of the park with every episode there. And I've also really been enjoying X-Men 97 on Disney Plus, and the most recent episode, probably one of the most powerful episodes of animation I've seen in a very long time. I did not see a lot of the events in that coming, and it's almost very mature for an animated show, especially about superheroes. And they treat the material very, very seriously. And it's really well done. I cannot wait to see where they're going with that. And I'm going to guess if this is my reading thing. So last week's guest were Dave Kletcha and Tobias Bakel, and they wrote this book called "The Runes of Engagement." Pretty much, Marines find themselves in Middle Earth, and so it's kind of like Marines take on dragons and D&D type monsters. Really enjoying it. I'm about halfway through it. It's a very fun read, and can't wait to. That was last week, so hopefully everybody listened to that one. They're like, I got to get this book because these guys were on the show, and Paul recommended it, and you can't get better than that. So that wraps it up for me. So Jamie, what about you? Reading, watching, what's been on your menu lately?
Yeah, it's funny. I've been watching Shogun. I watched the Steve Martin documentary. I haven't watched X-Men 97, but it's immediate after everybody on Twitter was talking about the fifth episode today, and I was like, it's on my list. So I'm definitely going to watch it. The Steve Martin thing is interesting though, because if you read his autobiography, which I did, it the autobiography I thought kind of said it all, but it's not true at all. The documentary says a lot more because I think he hides a lot about his private life in the autobiography, but when you see it from a third person perspective, you see just how kind of private and sort of self-isolating he is and stuff like that. And it's kind of interesting to see all that. I really enjoyed that documentary. So what am I watching? I'll name a weird one. This might not even be a really cool one, I guess, but I watched Elsbeth. Elsbeth is on, I guess it's Peacock. It's a spin-off character from The Good Wife. It was kind of this quirky spin-off character, and it's basically a procedural with a really quirky character. But it's the Kings, who do The Good Wife. They're the showrunners of The Good Wife and
Okay.
Evil, and everything they do, I kind of love. I just find that they're really competent. They kind of do standard stuff like a procedural, but they have their own special sauce they bring to it. The writing is always great. The dialogue is always great. The way they do clues and things like that, the kind of Sherlock Holmes of it all is always really good. Maybe a little like Poker Face,
Hmm.
if you've seen Poker Face.
I did
It's
see
kind
that.
of, yeah, it's less of a who done it. Instead, it's a how do they solve it kind of procedural. But anyway, I watched 2 episodes of that, dug it. Book wise, I'm trying to think. I'm reading De-Evolution by Max Brooks. It's a Bigfoot kind of story, which is kind of speaks to me. I haven't read it yet. But the last thing I read Ed Zwick's book, his kind of, and I guess it's not an autobiography, but whatever, about his
Oh yes.
career,
Okay.
hits, flops, and other illusions. And I love if like sometimes on podcasts, I'll just talk about this. I love behind the scenes books, especially with Hollywood.
Hmm.
I like sports, wrestling, and Hollywood are my three. If you can give me any of those, um, I'm all over it, and I get them. And his book's quite good. It talks about like making Glory, and making Blood Diamond, and his 30 something, and all these other things he's made throughout his career.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of good things about that, about the book. It is has definitely been highly recommended, really all over Twitter from what I've seen. I've even like even Ed himself is like talking about he's almost surprised at how well it's doing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I read it probably in a weekend. It's a really easy read. Kind of has like filmmaking and writing tips as well in there. It's kind of every chapter is divided in like tips for screenwriting or tips for directing and stuff like that.
That is fantastic. Okay,
Yeah.
well, Jamie, let's talk about a little bit about you. So, I mean, the job titles we listed at the start of the show, writer, director, producer. So, like, how did you get your start? Were you just like always into film? And I noticed, can't help but notice for those who are listening and not watching, he is wearing a Camp Crystal Lake T-shirt. So I think that kind of
Yeah, that's
gives you
right.
an inkling of his personality and what his taste of genres happens to be. So, I mean,
Absolutely.
were you a writer first, or were you just kind of like, "Hey, gang, let's go out and shoot a movie in the backyard"?
I was a mix of both. I wasn't sure which one I liked necessarily. I kind of lumped it all into the same thing. I really thought directing was writing and writing was directing, and whether I was going to write a novel or make a movie, it was all kind of like just being creative as a kid. I made a lot of haunted houses as a kid in the backyard. Um, I anything that was storytelling. I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of DMing, which I kind of lump in all the same stuff. I hated to play Dungeons and Dragons, but I love to DM. Um, so those are, you know, that was kind of my childhood, was all of those things. And Star Wars came out when I was a kid, so that was a big, thing. Raiders of the Lost Ark was a huge deal for me. But then the 80s, every horror movie I saw, I love the horror movies. Um, and all those VHS horror movies I just kind of grew up on, and I've seen them all. Um, so that was kind of my love for it. But then I really didn't get started. I was a computer programmer, and when the internet kind of showed up in the 90s was when I was programming. Some knowledge of screenwriting started to, emerge kind of from the net. So even though I didn't go to college for filmmaking, um, there was all kinds of knowledge and examples. I could get Final Draft, the computer program. There were contests. And one of the big things I think that pushed me into screenwriting or gave me an outlet, there was Francis Ford Coppola had a website called American Zoetrope back in the late 90s. Um, his company set up. It was basically a peer review website for screenplays. You could post one if you read three, so you had to read three, but then you could post one. And his people were trolling the site. So they were kind of like if yours bubbled up in kind of a crowdsourced way. And this is ahead of its time. This is like 95 to 2001 era. But it was kind of a crowdsourced way that he could find projects. And I don't think any projects ever came of that, but a lot of writers I know to this day um, came from that. Who's the guy who wrote Little Miss Sunshine? Like I think he
Oh,
posted
Michael Arndt.
Michael Arndt. I was going to say James Arndt, and I was like, that's wrong. Michael Arndt. He posted Little Miss Sunshine on that site at one point. So anyway, it just became a hobby with an outlet. I tend to be kind of obsessive. Like whatever I do, I have all these weird hobbies. Like I'm a juggler. I can juggle 5 balls and do all kinds of stuff because I go all in with anything I do. Right now it's pickleball. I'm just playing all day long. Um, and writing is that kind of hobby that I've always had the fire for, and just kind of went all in. And eventually I sold some stuff, and eventually I quit my computer programming job, and 20 some years later, that's what I do now. So that's
That's
kind of the
great. That I got to just with the pickleball, just be careful because I hear a lot of players are prone to injury
what
when
what
it comes to that.
I've been playing for 2 years. When I first started, I went through all the injuries. It was like calf, shoulder,
Oh
elbow,
God.
and after a while you kind of settle in, or maybe you stop like overdoing it or something. I don't know. You figure out how to casually play as opposed to be
Mhm.
like hurting yourself all the time. But
Of course, of course.
yeah,
So, okay, so let's kind of like work it all together. So, you grew up, loving the VHS horror films, and then you started getting into making films. So, I guess that was kind of like your film school. First, you were able to see it on screen, and then you got to experience for yourself. So, what were some of the lessons, I guess, not only just for the writing, but also for the filmmaking aspect? Did you think like I'm sure like with everybody, your first couple of attempts were just you're almost embarrassed to show them or to talk about them. But as time went on, you like were able to, I guess, finesse your skills.
yeah, there were a lot of writing lessons. I mean, as soon as you hear your stuff read out loud, and this is kind of something that novelists maybe don't get a chance to experience as much, but when you hear your stuff read out loud, it immediately changes your writing. You write, you start writing more concise. You start realizing some of the like on the nose stuff, the stuff that's hard to the stuff that when you hear it, it just sounds horrible. You just start. It's a great learning exercise to hear your stuff read out loud if you're a screenwriter. And I would encourage you just to get together with your friends and you know do live readings or something because it's a big help. So that was one thing. I say as being on film sets and being a director, what you quickly realize though is kind of the romance of it goes away and just how hard it is. The days are very hard, very stressful, and they're always stuffed to the gills with no wiggle room. Like it's always like everything has to go pretty much perfect to make it go to make schedule, and nothing ever goes perfect. So you never really make schedule. So it's just a series of compromises that you sort of have to make. I'm sure like if you made like an Avengers movie or something, it'd be different, because they have so much money, they just keep they add an extra day to the schedule. They have their own compromises they make. But yeah, it's so the romance of it kind of ran away pretty quick. And I still loved it, but it's just a different kind of it's really important as a director, for example. Um, a lot of your time is spent making the day. It's not making it great. Sometimes it's making the day. It's like, how can I get all these things in to the best possible quality, all in this limited time I have? And if you miss it, a lot of times you just don't get a chance to go back. So they were my biggest early lessons I think I learned from being on film sets.
Okay, so I actually do want to find out. So, I mean, when you were first starting, were you primarily a writer, and like, how did you make that transition into directing? Did someone say, "Hey, Jamie, I need you to, cover, you write a 5 minute horror short. Would you
Yeah.
be open to directing it too?" Or did you just kind of like, "I'm just going to do this, and I don't care who's going to stand in my way."
So it was kind of two parallel tracks, to be honest. There was on one hand, I was a computer programmer. I was making a good living, and I was like, you know what? I've always wanted to direct a movie. I'm gonna direct a movie, and that was my plan. So a lot of my initial scripts were written for me to direct. That was just the thing. And what I quickly learned was the scripts I was writing were far too big for somebody to make for free with their friends. That's the part I had to learn. And I had to realize what you could actually do and what you couldn't actually do. Because a lot of times, I guess in my head, I was like, "Oh yeah, we can make a war movie or something like that."
We
And I
can
mean,
have 300 guys coming over the hill.
yeah, and it does take some. I mean, maybe some people are smart enough not to do that from the beginning, but it took a little time to realize what I could and couldn't do. So those scripts ended up being ones I was like, well, what can I do with this script? I guess I have to sell it or something like that, or I have to make it. And then eventually I was able to figure out a script I can make myself. And my trick was to make it because, and this was back in the days of like Clerks and things like that. They were kind of a few years in the past, like the early 2000s, and the Blair Witch Project, for example. And um, my trick was I got really good people to do things I didn't understand, like camera and stuff like that. And I partnered up a lot. Like I had a co-director on a movie just because we were both in the same boat. So at least we could split the bill, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like that
Hmm.
was almost my thinking. It was like, well, if I put up 10,000 and he puts up 10, and we can make a $20,000 movie, or something like that. So most of them were just self-funded. and after I did that once, I was like, I'll never do it again because, my wife was like, what are you doing? Just blowing, $10,000 on something that nobody will ever see or something. Um, I would, I'm glad I did it. I'm so glad I did it. It was so worth $10,000 and a lot cheaper than going to film school. Um, and it's great memories, um, but I right away I knew, okay, well, that's the one I do like that. And now I got to do things some other way, but I still had the directing bug. So later on, people would come to me and say, hey, would you direct this thing or something like that? I've never directed anything huge. Like the budgets I'm talking about are always less than $500,000 or something like that. They're always um, very contained movies. So everything I've directed has been on a pretty low budget.
Okay, so it sounds like so you started out, I guess, as the writer, and then you kind of slowly added director, and almost you kind of were forced to become a producer as
Yeah,
well. Because I mean,
absolutely.
that's what a lot of writers. That's kind of like a lot of writers tend to follow that. That they think, okay, I want to write this, I'm going to make it myself, and then they realize, oh, I do not have enough money to make this the way I want it. So how can I how can I adjust this? So they're putting on their producer hat, and so
Mhm.
then they are able to hopefully get see it through
I
to the end. And
no,
I think that's like a great experience for any writer because a lot of writers think, oh, I just write it, I just hand it off to the director and they can do with it whatever they're going to. But I think a lot of people don't realize that, as you said, it there, yeah, it seems magical at the time, but it's a big, long process.
And to your biggest point, my quote on this always was, the thing I hate most about directing is producing. That was my quote. Because everything I directed, I had to self-produce. And that part I didn't like. I mean, I loved getting on the set and working with actors and figuring out how to make my script work and all that stuff. I didn't like to produce. I didn't really want to do that job. Like that was not fun. Um, but it was a necessity when you're at that level because nobody cares about the movie more than you essentially at that
Mhm.
level. Nobody really wants to join your project for producer credit. I mean, there are some that do, but it's the passion isn't quite as there because it really is hard work and producers don't get enough credit in some ways. A lot, and I think it's because some of them don't probably do a lot of work and some of them do. But but for sure it's yeah, producing is tough.
I've heard that as well. So is it kind of hard for you to differentiate between the roles? Like if you're a writer and the director says, "Okay, I love this scene, but we're going to change it around, or we're going to make this character a woman." I mean, or if you're the director, do you find yourself tweaking the script, or if you're the producer, do you look at the script and say, "Okay, we need to cut. This has too many people in it. We need to cut this." Or does the office have to be fancy? Can it be a boring and plain office? Are you almost like almost at odds with yourself when it comes to working on a project?
Yeah, I mean, all those things definitely happen, and they happen so fast and with so little thought. It's almost because there's just so many things that are important decisions that some of these lesser things sometimes you perceive them as lesser and they're not, they're bigger than they are. So I don't even notice those things anymore as the writer. Like when I watch a movie, it's more about like, oh, they added that dialogue or they added that thing to the character that wasn't there before. And most of the time I appreciate the additions more than anything else when I'm watching something like when I'm watching something that I wrote, I get the most joy out of like, oh, that's a new joke or that's a new thing. The additions are actually the fun part of it. Um, but yeah, I barely notice those kind of changes. I mean, you basically as a writer though, you are all you do when you watch your work that's produced is clocking the differences. You're like, that's new. Oh, they cut that. That's new. They cut that. And that's all you're really doing. Um, and there's a thing that I was told early on. T Terry Rossio has a website. Terry Rossio, do you know, word player?
Yeah, word player.
Um, yeah, and he's the guy who did Shrek and Aladdin and stuff like that. And when I was coming up, that was like my guy. That was like another like American Zoetrope word player. They were like my two things. Um, and he always kind of had this philosophy that I totally understand now that people really kind of get agitated. It's almost like a hot take when I say what this is. But you can't tell how good a screenwriter is from a movie. You just can't. Um, because we hand in our work. then it gets rewritten, sometimes on set, sometimes by the director, um, sometimes by the actors. Then it gets edited. And even if they were to, let's say they were to take a script and totally adapt it exactly the way it was written, but then cast it with some oddball choice that was doing like some they thought they were in a comedy and it was a drama. A lot of times the writers get blamed for that. Um, a lot of times the writers get blamed when there's like bad direction or something like that. And the acting is bad. They're like, oh, the script, because it's just the actors don't know how to. So it's really hard to tell unless you read the script that was submitted by the writer, whether or not the writing is good or not, or it's really hard to tell because you never know. ADR, they could after the fact loop in all new dialogue. They
Mhm.
do it all the time. Sometimes they put, like most of my experience with ADR, that's when all the on the nose stuff comes back. It's basically one big on the nose fest. They're just
Oh,
like,
wow.
yeah, it's like because once you got for a test and people like, I didn't really understand why they were sad. And then they kind of go into a panic and they're like, can you write some lines that say, I am sad because, or um,
Well, that's pretty on the nose.
yeah, yeah, and that's kind of so anyway, that's my feeling on watching your work. It definitely doesn't feel totally like my work once it becomes a film. I feel like a major part of it. I'm always very excited and happy to watch. But yeah, it's a lesson I learned that Terry said, and over the years I've come to understand that it definitely does become something else once the production comes about.
Okay, so and one of the things I noticed going through your list of credits is that there have been a lot more projects that you've been listed as a producer on. Now, is this just something like it's just a natural progression for you, or just like you keep finding out about these projects and you say, "Hey, I'd like to be involved." I mean, so how are you becoming more involved as a producer? And I, as you said, I know, writing and directing is a big undertaking unto itself, but producing, it's kind of like, hey, I want to be involved with this one. Oh, there's this other one over here, and then, oh, I just heard about this other guy. He's starting up a new thing. I just want to be involved.
Yeah, it comes about in all different ways. Like some of my recent projects, it's more that I've known about a script that I thought was perfect for, like people came to me like and said, "Hey, do you have a script for a, $50,000, $100,000 movie?" And I'm like, "I don't, but I know somebody that does, and we could work with them, we could develop it and stuff like that." So a lot of my producer stuff tends to be almost in the front end and then maybe in the back end for editing or something like that. So a lot of it still comes from the level of scripts, of developing material, of things like that. So at least the recent ones I think of, that's how they kind of came about.
Okay, so as a producer, but also an experienced writer, if so, like say you know of a script or you read a script and think this is really good, but it could use a little polishing. I mean, do you work with the writer or with the director to
Yeah.
like kind of like get the script in shape so you can really just put it out there and say, hey, we're looking for buyers, we're looking for takers.
Yeah, I think at that point, the director is really the one that does most of the push. Um, but just as somebody that, in most of these cases, these are friends and partners I've worked with for years and years, and we have a common language. And even the writers we're working with, it's all one big team. So, so the development process is more or less just shaping it and getting it ready. Most of these are pretty low budget and usually fast tracked as well. So
Mhm.
there's not a ton of time to do a huge amount of development. But what there is, even if it's 2 months or something like that, um, it's some of it becomes about budget. Like these are because a lot of the projects, if you look at my history, they're low budget things. So a lot of it is like this should be a $5 million movie. How can we do this for $100,000? Or so, a lot of the things I know I've worked on, that's the bulk of what needs to be messed with in order, like, how can this work on this budget? Like, what can we do to
For
change it to
something
make it work on
drastically
budget?
less than what it's listed as.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay. So have you had the pleasure of like reading a script and you're like, "Oh my gosh, I have to be involved with this," and you'd like try to get the ball rolling? Or have you read something and said, "I love this idea, but it's just not for me."
So, I'm not really in a position where people submit scripts to me too often, so I don't have that experience. It's funny because I'm a script consultant, so people submit scripts to me for that reason, not to that for consulting reasons. Not to, I never have sold a script or anything that I've consulted on. Most of the scripts that I've worked on in a producer level are more things from previous collaborators that I know. I'm like, oh, I don't have anything, but my co-writer on this last project has something perfect that, or sometimes I even just ask. I'm like, hey, do you have anything that could fit in this range, or would you like to pitch something that could fit in that range? And usually that's what gets the ball started. So it's less like I've ever like found a script or discovered anything or something like that. More, it's just right opportunity, right time, which is probably what 90% of the business really is, to be
Yeah, I was going to
honest.
say 99%
Not
almost.
probably 99. You're probably
Yeah.
right.
Okay, so all this experience working in film, writer, director, and producer, and now you've added audio drama to your
Hmm.
resume. So, I mean, this, from what I understand, this is a really growing field that more and more creative types are becoming involved with audio drama. So, what is your story? How did you become connected with it? And if you'll also definitely tell us a little bit about the project.
Yeah, sure thing. So this particular project came to me. It was a gig. It came to me a hired gig, and so and the best way, my favorite way, because somebody calls you out of the blue and there's no pitching or anything like that. It's like, hey, we need help with this thing. Um, and I've been wanting to do audio drama for a while. In fact, I've had two other go rounds with some pretty high level projects that were at the pitch level that never quite made it. And I was super excited to do it, and then they never quite made it. And I've had friends that have done it, and I've I've just been dying to do it. So when I got the call for this particular project, so in this particular project, it's an unusual one. It's called Black Velvet Fairies, and it's kind of a supernatural thriller. It's kind of like it's I'll give you the quick pitch and then I'll kind of explain a little bit more. The quick pitch is this woman Lucy, she gets this mysterious call. They say your grandmother has died, and she really doesn't know her grandmother, and she's left something for you in her house, but you have to come get it right away because there's people kind of milling about and they want to get it, and that's all she knows. So she kind of starts this podcast to document like her experiences. And she goes to the house. This kind of is a spoiler, but still, it's the pitch for the first episode. And she finds these kind of mysterious paintings of fairies on black velvet. And these paintings look like they depict almost like, I don't know, I might be reading into this a little bit because I know where it goes. Um, More like real life things or historic things or something like that, and less like just fantasy art. So anyway, hijinks ensue. And she goes on a deeper investigation. She finds out her family ties, supernatural stuff, all that kind of stuff. Um, and again, it's supernatural thriller, so it kind of slowly this supernatural stuff creeping into the real world. She's documenting this particular podcast. She brings on real life experts that play themselves. We have like Brian Dunning's a guy that does a podcast named Skeptoid. We have Greg Newkirk, who is a paranormal investigator in real life. And they kind of come in and play themselves and give real actual stuff that's really interesting. So anyway, that's the podcast. The weird part about it is the podcast is part of a much larger story world. It's this big world building project, and the people behind it are the people behind the original Blair Witch Project, at least three of them. And one of the producers actually is a producer of Lord of the Rings. So it's this much larger story world project, and it's almost like this experiment, this really cool experiment, kind of like Blair Witch was in some ways, the marketing at least, where there are things in the real world. In this podcast, there are actual things in the real world that exist. There are things on Twitter, there are things on the internet that if you listen to the podcast and you kind of do a little bit of digging, it'll start to expand a little bit outside of the podcast. But beyond that, this story world, it has a board game, it has a novel, it has this kind of online game that I don't quite understand involving what is it? What's the I can't think of what the term is. The crypto I can't think of what those
Cryptids.
not cryptids. The so anyway, I can't think of the term. I don't know why I'm blanking on the term.
It's
Oh,
yeah, I'm going with cryptids or cryptocurrency. There's only two I can think.
no, cryptocurrency, but what are the objects related to
Oh,
cryptocurrency called? I can't
Bitcoin.
think of them. Now they're like, you know how you can buy a piece of art?
NFTs.
NFTs. That's the
Okay.
word I was looking for. I blanked on NFTs.
And
I'm glad you could figure it out because I was feeling foolish. So there's like NFTs hidden in the world and stuff like that. I'm not part of that side, obviously. I didn't even know what that is. But those all relate to this bigger story world. So when I was hired to write and direct this podcast, um, there was a sandbox that I had to stay within.
mm.
It was like this is your part of the world, and there are rules to this bigger part of the world, and you kind of have to stay within that. So there was a lot of guidance and things like that.
Okay, yeah, so that raises a great question. It's like how do you direct audio drama? I mean,
Mhm.
is everybody on a Zoom call? I mean, do you get together in a studio and everybody's
Yeah,
standing at a microphone? Is it like old time radio where you have, you got your sound guy over there, or you have or
yeah,
I guess today would be someone on the computer with the sound effects?
yeah. So I loved directing audio drama. It was my like I said when I finished it, it's my favorite thing about directing and none of the other stuff. It's just my favorite thing. So all day long, actors would pop up on a Zoom,
Okay.
and we set them up with a really good sound system in in their home or microphones and stuff like that. We kind of tested them and things like that beforehand. They would pop into the Zoom, and I would just get to direct actors on script all day. And there was no rearranging the lights, no,
You got
none
to
of
hit your
the
mark.
yeah, it was so much fun because literally it was nonstop directing and acting, and that's all it was. It was so much fun. I mean, if you like directing, it's kind of like the most purest form of directing you could possibly have. So it was a lot of fun.
And it sounds like you got to like really see the emotions come through on the actors. Like, okay, you're scared, you're terrified, you're skeptical.
Yeah, yeah, and we had some really good actors. So the lead is Gretchen Lodge, and she was the star of a movie I wrote, Lovely Molly, and she's a really strong actor. And when we got her to be in it, I mean, she totally brings it to any project she's in. And it was, I mean, she's so committed. It was, and she has to go to some pretty emotional depths for the project because there's a big mix of being scared, but also being emotional, finding out family stuff and things like that. So it was great. It was great. I'd love to do it again.
And it sounds like it's almost freeing for the actors. Like they don't have to worry about how they look on camera. It's
Right.
just like they can just really let loose and be as, crank it up to 11, so to speak, and just have as much fun with it, even if it's a serious or a scary scene, that they can just like really throw themselves into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're so, so they're not worried about makeup. They're not worried about hitting the lights. They're not worried about it's just like pure acting. It's just like it's that's what's so cool about it. It's just like we sit there and you can do a lot of takes because they're so fast. It's like, okay, let's do another. Okay, let's do, no real ramp up time. There's no we used like yards, I think it's called Yardstream. Is that the project? The app. And it basically was just kind of like we're doing the Zoom call right now, where it's like a live feed. So it's not like takes or anything. Like we'd
Mhm.
mark it in the audio, but that's about it. And the cool thing about that particular app, it records on their computer level. So it basically each one of their computers is recording and then it all syncs up in the end. So
Hmm.
you get, really good sound that from each computer as opposed to like a stream, which like Zoom or something, which kind of mixes it all for you.
Right. So how many episodes was it, and how long did it take for all of the production work before it was released?
Hmm. Yeah, it's 13 episodes. Um, and it took about 2 months of very intense writing, because they kind of picked me up about 2 months before they needed it based on the schedule. Um, then it took about a month to record. When I say a month, it really took about, I don't know, 8 days, something like that, tops. It just kind of spread out.
Sure.
It was Christmas. That's why it felt like a longer time because it was like, oh, the
Yeah,
run
that
up and then we're
it's
off. And
not too
yeah,
busy a time of year.
yeah, exactly. And then we basically edited it from January until about now, maybe a couple weeks ago. And, you know, it's episodic. So as long as you finished episode 1, you still have time for episode 13. But we've already finished all of our episodes by now. Like a couple weeks ago, I think we handed
Okay,
in our
so
last
I was
episode.
going to say, was it all released at once, or was it almost like a weekly? Okay, here's
It
episode one, and next week is episode two.
it is being released every week. Right now, well, by the time this is released, they'll probably be on 5 or something like that, um, out of 13. So it's not too far if you just want to listen to the whole thing straight. You only have, well, you still probably have 2 months to go, be 13 episodes. And each of the episodes is about, it could be anywhere. There's a lot of freedom. It could be anywhere from 15 to 25 minutes per episode, I'd say. I think some of them might even be 10 now that I think about it. Some of the later
Yeah,
episodes.
real quick. So even though you spent so much time on the writing, was there any improv done by the actors, or like, hey, what if I tried this instead, or oh, okay, let's change that line to this instead?
I love doing improv with actors. So as much as I could, I would just say, we do it, and I'd say, okay, just do whatever you want, give it a try. And a lot of times what they do is they'd kind of riff on the actual lines. Like they'd almost like take it line per line, but change each line per line is how they did it, as opposed to like a pure improv, so they kind of kept the schedule of the scene almost, but they changed the words or some of the delivery or added jokes or something like that. I find when they do that, it just frees them to sound more natural. It's like they stop thinking about the lines, they kind of get out of themselves, they kind of just let it rip. And usually it's like, hey, do a fun take, do what you want. I don't care, try something interesting.
After the fun take, or the one like, I don't care, did any of those end up in the end product, or was it just kind of like, oh, we're just going to get this to get it out of our system?
Oh yeah, no, I'm sure a lot of them ended up in the final product. It almost becomes interchangeable because once I do that recording, I kind of forget about the script. I'm not even really following the script. Now I have this other thing that's guiding me, And when I say me, I have an editor, Jordan Miller. He's kind of our sound engineer and editor, and it was really his job to parse through all the little takes and stuff, and the hours and hours, and put it together. And he kind of constructed that initial cut, and then I'd go in and give notes. Um, but at that point, you know, anything goes. Whatever works works. Whatever's best works.
Okay,
Um,
okay,
yeah.
so now that that one's all wrapped up, do you have plans to do another one, or is it still in the plotting and planning stage, or you're like, hey, I got a great idea for a follow up to this one?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I see with that one, it definitely has a cliffhanger ending. It definitely, if we ever did season two, it would definitely expand. And I think season two depends more on the larger story world than it does necessarily our podcast. Our podcast is kind of like the first little thing in a much bigger, expansive world. But we've already had talks about where that could go for sure. I would love to do another audio drama though. It's just like I said, it's so much fun. It is a ton of work. Um, it's I teach screenwriting, and a lot of times people will come up to me and talk about making their own movie and stuff like that. And in recent years, I've said, why don't you turn it into an audio drama? Because unlike me, who had to spend 10, $20,000 on my film, I think you legitimately could make an audio drama for the price of pizza and some new hardware.
Hmm.
If you had friends that were actors that wanted to do it, and they just all wanted, you make the band and you do it, I think you could do a really good audio drama for probably the cheapest price. It's probably cheaper than a graphic novel, probably cheaper than a short film, probably. So I don't know. I think if you have stories, I think it's a good place to try out in a low budget.
Oh, that's great. Oh, so and one last question is, I mean, so this is, as you said, it's like supernatural and thriller and fantasy. Is there a genre specifically for audio drama that you haven't tried, or you're really, hey, I'd really like to give this a go, like, something that's like pure farce or comedy, or like something like a western. I mean,
Yeah,
just
it's
anything.
It's so funny that you say that because you listed one of the ones that we may try. We have basically a spoof disaster movie.
Oh,
And
that's nice.
we did a script reading of it and it was really funny. And I was like, maybe this should be an audio drama. So I thought about kind of rewriting it to position it as like a classic, almost radio drama or something like that. The other one, a friend of mine and I, we wrote a screenplay that got a lot of attention years ago. It was almost like a pulpy, um, Tarzan-y kind of story. and it it's a great story with a good high concept. And if we could do it like the old fashioned style that those kind of things were made in, it might be fun. So we've always kind of toyed around with doing that. So anyway, they're the two I that come to mind.
Oh, that is fantastic. Okay, so the one we've been talking about, that is Black Velvet Fairies, and you can find all of the latest episodes and the ones yet to come on bloodydisgusting.com, written and directed by our very special guest today, Jamie Nash. Jamie, this has been fantastic talking to you. I loved all the stuff you had to say. Where can people find you online? Any social media platforms?
Yeah, and can I make one little correction to that?
Oh,
Uh,
sure.
so so Bloody Disgusting, what you probably saw a press release released on Bloody Disgusting, but it's not a Bloody Disgusting production. So you actually find the podcast on Spotify,
Oh, okay.
Apple, all the usual places. But it's actually not a Bloody Disgusting did a great initial kickoff for us, like a launch kind of release. But yeah, it's just all everywhere you can find podcasts, you'll find it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah,
Um,
that's the link that I saw the most. So I was making
I
that connection.
I kept sharing it because it was like the most shareable link, so I just kept popping that up. Um, and we love Bloody Disgusting. We worked with on the VHS movies with them, so they're always great to us. So you can find me mostly. I'm on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it at Jamie_Nash. I also have a website if you're interested in anything like my books or my consulting or anything else, and that's jamienash.net.
JamieNash.net. Okay. And Jamie_Nash on the bird one. It used to be a
That's
bird
right.
one.
That's right.
All right. Well, again, Jamie, thank you so much. This has been great stuff. Had a fantastic time talking today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It was a great time. Thanks so
Oh,
much.
fantastic. Okay. Well, like he said, he's Jamie. I'm Paul. This has been the Creating Writing Life podcast. And you can check out my books on Amazon, the Go Ahead and Ask series about screenwriting. You can check out my screenwriting blog, Maximum Z, at maximumz.blog. Like I said, I'm still on Twitter because honestly, I'm not going to call it the other thing, at Maximum_Z. And I'm also on Instagram at Pez Screenwriting, PEZ Screenwriting. And feel free to like, comment, subscribe to all of the things. And also, we're on Twitter for this show at Podcast CWL. Again, thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy. Most importantly, go write something.